in research, advocacy, and of course, on the ground. Clay joins us from the University of Hawaii, where he has specialized in fire science and has published countless papers on the increasingly pervasive issue of fire, wildfire, more specifically. Elizabeth joins us from the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. Elizabeth is based on Big Island, but she works with communities across the state to help them better prepare for wildfires and to make themselves essentially as safe as possible in light of this increasing issue. And the Wildfire Management Organization has been around for about 20 years. We also have Bula, a former Honolulu firefighter and the owner of Makaha Aqua Farms. He has an intimate understanding of the risks of wildfire, considering he and his community are on the front lines and have felt the direct effects and seen the direct effects of wildfire in Waianae Valley. One thing they all have in common is, of course, they have known wildfires becoming an increasing issue here in Hawaii, one that necessitates a response. They've been doing work for years, raising awareness, sounding the alarm, and teaching everyone they know about the confluence of issues that come together to create the situation that we have today. So without taking up too much time, I will try and pass over to Clay, because I would really like to kick off this conversation today and really help demystify some of the concerns, issues, and ideas about wildfire here across Hawaii. So Clay, I'm just wondering, perhaps could you please start with giving us an understanding of how fire really works on Hawaii's landscape, what the wild-urban interface is, and why that really matters when we're having these conversations about wildfire?
Right. So, yeah, I've written a lot about how fire works and how fire has changed in Hawaii. And really, the simplest way to think about it is these three ingredients that really drive how and where and when fire occurs on the landscape. It's pretty simple. You need the right climate or weather conditions, right? So hot, dry, windy days. And we also know that we get these sort of longer term patterns in our climate. So we tend to have higher fire risk on leeward areas, right, throughout the year, just because they're in the rain shadow. But we also get periodic drought. We also get, wet and dry cycles over the course of the year. And so that wet and dry dynamic is really what drives persistent fire risk. So wet periods build up fuels and then they cure when it dries out and sort of, sets up the landscape for fire when an ignition occurs, right? So that's the second ingredient is ignitions, and almost all of them in Hawaii are caused by people. About 75%, from what we know, which is a very small percentage, but from what we know, about 75% are accidental, which means they're likely preventable, right? So these are non-intentional starts, things like, using machinery on hot, dry, windy days, fireworks when it's the wrong conditions for it, parking your car in tall grass, things like this that start fires, open fires, barbecuing, things like that. And it's important to know that those ignitions are happening like constantly, right? So we're about 800 to 1,000 ignitions every year across the state. And so that part of that ingredient is like constant. There's always this risk of ignition, and it's sort of changed. It's a function of people, right? How many people are there and where are they doing stuff on the landscape? And then the last ingredient is vegetation or fuels. And really, this is the one that I study the most. I mean, my background is botany and plant science. And what we're dealing with in Hawaii is huge expansion in recent decades of these fire-prone vegetation. So these non-native grasses and shrubs, things like guinea grass or California grass, buffalo grass, Haulikoa, and they dominate about 1 million acres statewide. It's about a quarter of our state land area is covered in these fuels. And the important kind of caveat here is it's not just the presence of those fuels, but it's when they go unmanaged, right? So when we're talking about all these landscapes that kind of surround our communities, that's like the foot of our watersheds that are, where there's not much being done there anymore, right? So these grasses kind of dominate those areas. And this is a legacy really of agricultural declines in Hawaii. So we've seen huge declines in plantation agriculture, and as well as grazing. Like the footprint of those operations have shrunk. When you pull that stuff off the land, it fills in with grasses. And yeah, if you want to show that fire history, the
Slide
long-term
5.
history that we have, that first slide, this really shows that reflects that change in land use. So within the past few decades, this big decline in agricultural land use, and that's when we see this big jump in fire activity. And
Thank
you asked
you.
about one more thing. So the WUI, which is this wildland urban interface, and that's really kind of where the brush meets the built environment. And so rather than a lot of examples on the mainland where it's like we build new subdivisions into fire-prone areas, for the most part in Hawaii, it's our communities have been where they are and the landscape around them has changed. So when we talk about the WUI, what we mean is this interface where you've got high fire risk and then the built environment. And so our communities, in addition to like not managing these fuels, our communities are also not adapted to withstand fire impacts, right? In terms of infrastructure, in terms of building codes, all of those things. So we're sort of left unprepared for these events when they happen.
Thanks, Clay. That's fantastic and really gets to the heart of so many issues there. I'm wondering if you could tell us all really a little bit about this paper that you published in 2015 that really kind of revealed a lot of these trends and these facts that you're talking about. Could you tell us about how you really pulled all of that data and found that trend, and what kind of happened after that, after the publishing of that paper, and really, how it informed your research until now,
Right.
into grasses, land management, all of those kind of things?
Yeah, well, that was really fortuitous timing. So I started working on fire at the University of Hawaii in 2013, and it was just happened that Elizabeth Pickett and folks at Hawaii Wildfire had just compiled for the first time all of the state records. So they had, prior to that, been sitting with each county fire department or with the national parks, for example. And so we finally like put this all together and started looking at where these large fires were happening. And this is not to say that like we figured this out or cracked the code on this, because people had started worrying about this long before us in the firefighting community. But just seeing that the vast majority of these areas are burning are in these like abandoned agricultures, these non-native grasslands, lowland areas. So two things that really jumped out when we started looking at this was we started looking at the extent of this vegetation, that's kind of these mind-boggling stats where you're talking about, this 1 million acres. That's really the work that came out of, where we have this really, really huge land area that's dominated by these grasses and these shrubs that are all been introduced, and as well as just that tie to agricultural land use history, right? So we're not, fire, at least where I was coming from, was often framed as this impact up on the resources of Mauka. So our native ecosystems don't really recover from fire. It kills the trees, and then these grasses kind of spread in. And that's really where we were kind of framing these fire impacts. But really what it pointed to us is the driver is not like the grasses themselves, right? It's the societal changes that are a function and then really link us back to the longer term history in Hawaii of land use, land privatization, the kind of imposition of, colonial forms of commodity production, sugar, pineapple, ranching. And then all of a sudden you get this economic shift to farming homes, right? Instead of these commodity crops, where you can let those lands lie. I mean, no one's making money off that anymore. And so again, it's this economic model or economic incentives that are really driving that shift in land use. And this is really, it was that paper that kind of started cracking open this, it's a bigger picture thing. And it's important because that points to like how we need to sort of reorient ourselves to solve this. And I'll just add that the other big thing when you talk about land use change from the perspective of the firefighters is that it's not just now that those fuels are kind of filling in all these spaces and are left unmanaged, but the people that worked on those plantations were doing all this work to maintain roads, maintain water, work with firefighters when they responded. So we see this huge burden shift onto the firefighters as those operations shut down, and not much change, as far as resources devoted to those to fire suppression in the aftermath.
Fantastic. Thank you, Clay. That's great. Actually, on the note of firefighters, I'd love to ask you, Buller. You know, you've been a firefighter yourself for Honolulu County, and you have your own land, of course, in Waianae Valley, and you've been seeing this risk really seemingly on a daily basis. You know, living on the leeward coast of Oahu. Um, could you tell us a little bit about, and actually, well, that led you to Clay and Elizabeth, I believe. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing in managing your land to mitigate or prevent the risk of wildfires in your farm and in your community?
Yeah, so when what like Clay was saying earlier that you have this large landmass that's unmanaged, and so at my property there's 1,100 and I think it's 1,100 acres that surround an ag park that I'm in. This 1,100 acres is a hot spot that that where fires occur constantly, and when these fires get out of control, um, and they make whatever direction they're going in, they're going to reach my farm and several other farms along the way. So we're basically impacted, or my farm and several other farms along the way are impacted by this constant threat. And like Clay was saying, that it's a matter of unmanaged fuels that haven't been managed for so long, and so I've taken not only me, there are other entities within the valley that are trying to, like, we're trying to surround that 1,100 acres with by removing the vegetation or removing the fuels around these hot spots. So if we go around and remove the fuel from the hot spots where these ignitions occur, um, hopefully we can cut down on how many times these incidents happen. So what I was trying to do was trying to gather all the landowners that surround this area and try to educate them, or try to give them the education so that they can go around and remove these fuels from the surrounding areas. So that's what I was trying to do.
I understand, Buller, that you have on your own land, you've been maintaining a fire break for some time. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think in around well, in 2018 I experienced what a lot of people experience in Lahaina. So in 2018, the fire, a large fire had broken out in three valleys on the west end. So we have Makaha Valley, we have Waianae Valley, and Nanakuli Valley, and all three valleys had caught fire. And so the resources were spread so thin at the time, and believe it or not, the conditions were almost the same too. So we had large 40 to 50-mile-an-hour winds, and they came through. The fire got out of control, and because the resources are spread so thinly, a lot of these areas that are normally protected weren't protected at all, and so it ended up burning through the ag park, around the ag park, and it destroyed. After the fire was done, the Honolulu Fire Department claimed that there were no structures destroyed, and I witnessed 7 structures destroyed within the ag park. So that's when I decided that I would have to try to protect my farm a little bit better, and I looked towards getting a WUI grant. I went after a WUI grant to try to see if I could remove those fuels in a strategically placed area, and maybe stop those fires from occurring. In doing so, going after the WUI grant, it was something new for me, and I needed a nonprofit sponsor when I went after this grant, and I had some support from some other people that gave me contributions, and that motivated me even more. But when I was out looking for a nonprofit that would support my task, I had heard of Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, and when I finally got to meet them, it was a marriage made in heaven for me, because they were they were already doing what I wanted to do in my community, and they had been doing it for a couple of years already, and they really jumped in and supported me a lot going after this grant.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bulla. I guess naturally I have to ask Elizabeth. You know, now you've been working with folks like Bulla for a long time. People like Bulla who have, you know, rather larger tracts of land, and then working with homeowners, working with communities across Hawaii, setting up Firewise communities, having this kind of ambassador program, having this, what, you know, in our conversations, you've told me, you know, you've really been quite systematic about raising awareness at the community level, and trying to get people to create safer conditions for themselves in their homes. But could you tell us a little bit and share how your kind of approach has been in your time at HWMO and over the course of HWMO's kind of lifespan?
Sure. I guess I can start off by saying that our organization was founded in 2000. So 23 years we have been focused full-time on wildfire. All our employees are full-time thinking about wildfire and have been this whole time. And so I just want to point out how large the attendance is right now, and just say thank you to everybody for joining in, because we welcome that broader learning and we need that broader action taking. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Civil Beat and thank you for organizing all of this so that we can continue to build our partnerships and do all this together. But I'll start off by saying that Hawaii Wildfire was founded in 2000, and we were founded by fire chiefs and state forestry leadership and ranchers and farmers and community members and conservation folks who were all noticing that fires were getting bigger. There were more of them. There weren't programs in place already. There wasn't a lot of information, science, or data. And it wasn't what anyone had seen before. So on the ground, our land stewards and our fire folks were really noticing changes. And then as they started to try to see what they could make happen within their own agencies, they realized that the work was going to be a long game, getting proper attention, getting proper funding, and still yet it would be limited to their own jurisdiction. And fire doesn't care about fences, doesn't care about jurisdictions. It really travels according to landscape and weather and fuels and all these different things. And fires don't necessarily only impact natural resources or only impact the built environment. And it takes more than firefighting, which is the last line of defense, to actually move the needle and move toward protection and preparedness. So realizing this was a boundary spanning kind of issue, they founded Hawaii Wildfire to be collaborative, to invite everyone to the table, to learn together, to prioritize what we needed to do next, and to co-design a work plan that would try to hit the big things, try to pave the way for more understanding, et cetera. So we started with a collaborative approach. And as we started on Hawaii Island, and then over the years expanded to Maui and across the state. And now we work across the entire Western Pacific, because fires are increasing across our entire Pacific region. And that model of place-based, know the people, learn together, identify what needs to happen together, and then work toward those solutions together has been hugely effective, because we haven't had proper attention for funding. There's no local or state funding really or programming for mitigation or preparedness. Education is very limited from our agencies. And so Hawaii Wildfire works totally hand in hand and in partnership with our fire departments and our state forestry to hear what's needed, decide what we all want to do, and then Hawaii Wildfire goes after competitive grant funds to carry out those projects and programs. And so we are entirely donation and grant funded, but we have pulled off a lot with just a shoestring budget and barely enough attention from elected officials and others over the years. We've pulled it off because of those collaborations and because of that teamwork approach. And so the things we have going on now are really good. We share our science and information focused wildfire work and project with Clay, who you heard from at UH. Together, we co-lead the Pacific Fire Exchange Project, which is entirely focused on understanding our trends and patterns of fire, developing best practices for mitigation. So it's really science and information focused so that we really know a lot now about fire and about where to go next and about, you know, the best mitigation practices we can employ in Hawaii. Because before that, a lot of it was mainland focused, and now we know a lot about how to do it and what needs to be done in Hawaii. We run our FireWise Communities program, which is a neighborhood level risk reduction program. If you're interested and you're on this and you're watching, please contact us because we want to help you organize your neighbors to start working on things that are going to reduce your risk. And then we work with land managers and others and folks stewarding landscapes like Hula to do fuels management work and to identify even where we need to do fuels management work. And we're really working toward a model, also collaborative, of something that we're modeling after programs in the mainland that are called All Hands, All Lands. Because in Hawaii, we have a patchwork of private and public ownership, but fire doesn't care about that. And we need our fuels management and our mitigation efforts to make sense across ownerships. And so we have been working really hard to pave the way for that kind of mitigation work in ways that make sense on the landscape and with weather patterns and fire behavior, as opposed to piece by piece siloed efforts. And we support our fire agencies and try to make sure that they're going to have adequate water infrastructure, access, and support to have safe and effective firefighting. So one thing, you know, Clay mentioned a lot about fuels, and I want to just supplement that and say that we have lots of fuels on the landscape. It's a huge driver of our issues. But if you want to pull up that slide number 5, the one with the map and all the red dots, I was thinking we could just show everybody that wildfire ignitions are happening on all sides. That was it. Are happening on all sides of every island all the time. And those ignitions are caused by people, like Clay said. Keep going. It has blue squares and then red dots on. There we go. So all those red dots, those are ignitions by humans. Campfires, fireworks, barbecues, driving on dry grass, equipment like welders and grinders, all the way to power utility equipment. But these are all ignitions that require a firefighting response. And so we have ignitions happening on both sides of every island. So this is a statewide issue. It's predictable. We know that humans are starting fires. So the very first part of fire prevention and mitigation is like adjusting our behaviors to not be accidentally starting fires. And I don't know if I mentioned fireworks, but that is a big deal too. So fires are happening on everywhere in the state, and it's because of our behaviors. But where those ignitions match up with these unmanaged fuels, they're not spontaneously combusting. We are accidentally starting them on fire. But then if it's an unmanaged landscape, we're not just talking about any old grass anywhere. We're talking about unmanaged lands where it can keep getting thicker and denser and more fire prone and more hazardous. When we have our accidental ignitions match up in those areas where we have fuels, we have a recipe for fire. And then when those fires are able to travel so quickly, because we don't have great access, we don't have water infrastructure on the land, we have fire departments that are amazing at what they do, but they don't have the capacity that we wish they had, or the access, or all the things, all the budgets that we wish they had. It hits the built environment, and our built environments have not been designed for safety. So there's a lot of pieces to this equation, and it's no one thing, and there's no one player responsible. There's a role for everyone to play, and there's information that we've developed to support everyone in their roles, from community leaders and elected officials to planners, architects, engineers, landscapes, communities, children, and schools, and K through 12 teachers. There's a lot going on that contributes to the kind of things we see with fire. And so Hawaii Wildfire is trying to, at the statewide level, support different sectors to do their parts. And a huge part of the work we do is with communities and land stewards. But we are starting to dive into those other realms, because as we cried over the Maui and Hawaii Island fires, like, what did we miss? It's really the funding and regulatory environment that we haven't worked a lot in, because we've always worked with the willing partners who really want to take action. And now we realize there's these big gaps of folks who don't know how to take action, don't have the capacity to, or until now haven't for whatever reason. And it's those areas that we're starting to dive into because our existing programming is robust. And especially now, we have had so much interest, and we're so thankful for that because we want to continue to support people in their risk reduction work. But there's only so far each of those things can go without the proper regulatory and funding environments. And we need attention in the wildfire and fire world. And we need funding to be allocated in that direction so that we can really meet with programming and risk reduction, the level of threat that we face.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You know, one thing that I wrote about earlier on was exactly that, the amount of funding that is put towards wildfire across the state. So far as I know, most of your funding has come from federal kind of grants and that kind of thing, which are all competitive. We are competing with the rest of the country. And Department of Land and Natural Resources is the only real kind of state firefighting force specific to wildland firefighting, and county fire departments actually specialize in more so in structural fires. What I've been thinking and what I'm wondering is both yourself and Clay, please feel free to weigh in, Clay. You both sat before lawmakers, maybe just a few of them, in 2018. You raised the alarm. You told them, you know, a lot of what you're telling us now. Perhaps, you know, really underscoring the need for some better resources. As you're moving up from that community level to try and get the policies in place, what are your suggestions for those viewing in terms of how they might be able to really see some change in terms of funding or policies or any kind of statutory help that might help mitigate the risk going forward? And thanks to one of our listeners for putting in that question.
Well, I can start, but then I know that I'm sure Clay and Bula want to chime in. I would start with saying Division of Land and Natural Resources needs adequate funding. Our fire departments need adequate funding. It's a lot to just expect. Why didn't they do more when the theys that we know don't have capacity? And so I think people need to understand that there are a lot of really good actors and smart, capable people who know what needs to happen next, and not a lot of places to look to be able to actually achieve any of the goals or needs. So I think we can all advocate at the state level for DLNR and at the county level for our fire department partners to have what they need, not at the bare bones, try to make do with less and less each year, but actually what they really need to be as safe and as effective as possible for the highest public good and safety. So that, I mean, that's managing lands on one side, it's having fire suppression capacity and educational capacity on the other hand. But both of those are really needed. So I think we all need to advocate for that and not just have Clay and I trying to argue for it and have all lawmakers except for 3 leave the room, because we have had that experience for this entire time. And I think there might be reasons behind that, but now we're in an era where there is more understanding that it's not really an issue we can be complacent about anymore. And we really welcome, again, the broader learning and the proper allocation of funds so that the folks who are already on the ground trying to make things happen can actually do what they need to do. And then, of course, we're a nonprofit and we're carrying the load of all the wildfire programming and community programs. We are bending over backwards to meet the need right now. But we compete across the country and hustle trying to get enough money to do that. And so we don't know usually if we're going to be able to continue that ongoing. Somehow 23 years it's worked out. But just so everyone knows, like we are not a part of all of the philanthropic efforts that have been going on. I don't know any fire or land stewards who have really been beefed up as a result of the donations that have coming into other entities. And so we're all just linking arms and being like, I guess we do what we normally do and just do what we can. But advocating and supporting the groups that I've mentioned, the agencies and folks like Hawaii Wildfire that are really working on the ground with communities toward preparedness, that's an important start. But I think there's other policy and legislation we can explore in terms of code and code enforcement and things like that. Do you have anything else you want to say, Clay?
I do. It's pretty simple in the sense that all of the funding to do fuels mitigation primarily comes from federal grants, which are competitive. So as Hawaii, right, imagine for Lahaina, you're putting in these applications and you're going up alongside California and Nevada and these other states where fire issue is much more, I guess, well established, well known. And so we've always kind of got low ranked on those. And speaking of California and Oregon just did this recently too, in light of that sort of nature of those grants, they sort of said, we're not going to depend on federal funding. We're going to set our own state budget for fuels mitigation. So they, and that what that ends up doing, you can use that to get match. So a lot of these federal funds require match, for example, matching funds from non-federal sources. And they just said, let's just remove ourselves from that equation. The need is here at the state level, and so we can fund these projects ourselves. And so that's one of the basics. I mean, we just need resources made available. The other thing is we have to realize that, like, even if it's easy to say like DLNR and Division of Forestry and Wildlife are by far under-resourced considering the amount of land that's under their care. And so, but also that they're limited to their boundaries, right? They can't just go off of their lands and start doing fuels management, right? So you need capacity to coordinate across all these different landowners and these different agencies and utilities and things. So we really need to kind of be thinking about this programmatically and systematically and say, all right, like here's the need, and we can identify where the risk is high. We can identify which communities are most vulnerable, and we can start with that. But we really have to kind of put investment into this. And it's more a reflection. So like the Lahaina fire it was preventable. I mean, this is the kind of weight that we have to carry with us, like all of us, is that this thing was preventable. It's not like sea level rise and all these other things that we think about climate change and we're like, oh, what can we do locally? We could have done many things locally. And because on the fuels management side, we're doing so little that like almost anything else will be better, right? Like, and that opens up all of these different options to transform these fuels, to change them into something else, beginning with grazing, right? You can do fuel break networks, things like this. You can do farming, you can do reforestation. Like there's a whole list of actions that we could be taking on these lands that would have prevented Lahaina from being lost, okay? And so how do we do that? And why aren't we doing it should be the question that we're asking ourselves. And that really comes back to, again, the societal investment. Like, where do we as county, state, as governments, like where are our resources going? And you look at models like the Watershed Partnership. So this is like the Watershed, Hawaii Association of Watershed Partnerships. They're out there. They kind of link these different landowners together to protect watershed forests. But when it comes down to it, those watershed partnerships, it's like a crew leader, right? A coordinator and like a field crew. But maybe like 6 people, 5 people doing this work. And so when we look at these things that are models to change, to transform landscape, we have the skills and knowledge, but we are totally underinvested in any kind of form of land care. And that's really what it comes down to. Like all of our resources, all of our energy, like where is development happening? It's like, look outside your door, like from wherever your communities, walk out to the edge and look at that landscape up towards the mountain, and it's empty, right? We're not doing anything on these lands. And so it's obviously it's emotional and it's angering because what's happening is we see the vulnerability now, right? So now is this moment when we can kind of think about what changes can we make? And it can be, it's not like rocket science. We can change these conditions on the ground.
And if I could add on to what you're saying, I have started to even have clarity on it in the last 5 weeks, which is that there are lots of good stewards, farmers, ranchers, people grazing, conservation, restoration, reforestation, watershed partnerships. There are a lot of folks who just need capacity to do the work, and they have knowledge and they have passion. It's just that they need capacity. And that is the realm we've been trying to work in, help compete for grants and whatever else. It's just under resourced. And then there are folks who haven't come to the table, won't come to the table. And that's where we have those challenges in making anything make sense, because we have this patchwork of private and public land ownership. And so for those, that's where we are advocating and working on, updating our fire codes and building capacity so we can enforce them if they're not willing to be good players, honestly. So we have these two buckets of things that need to happen. And anything other than leaving it stand and get denser and thicker and drier, ad infinitum, is better than doing so. So that means anything from weed whacking to grazing corridors to small scale planting. We call it fuels conversion, but you can plant things that are not as fire prone. All the way, I mean, the world is our oyster, even like bike paths and community gardens and all these creative, beautiful solutions that have that can be community assets. But right now there's not much of that and no capacity. And then we have this challenge with land ownership. So I think it's going to take a lot of us to brainstorm what solutions we want to pursue and how to get there. Because so far we've just been trying to do whatever we can possibly pull off and compete and get small little bits of money for. But I think that there's a broader level of planning and solution finding we can achieve. But again, we need coordination for that. We need the funding to coordinate. We probably need some legislation. We definitely need budget allocations. That's why, we say there's a role everyone can play, because there's an advocacy role, there's planning and development and firefighting and community preparedness. There's actually something we all need to be doing if we want to improve this.
That brings me to you, Bulla. I'm really interested. I know you have strong feelings about your community and about how your community's dealing with the risk. You've really been kind of raising some interesting points that I've would really appreciate you sharing in terms of the risk that yourself and your community has and how that compares to other islands. I'm just wondering, what kind of lessons have you learned in your dealing with this issue that you think you could share with others, no matter what part of Hawaii they're on?
Well, one of the lessons I learned that, and Elizabeth spoke about funding and trying to get funding. I mean, originally I was trying to go after a WUI grant, and that I didn't realize how difficult it was. And then when I found out that no one in Hawaii had acquired one, I got cold feet, and I decided not to try for the grant. And in doing so, Hawaii Wildfire just stepped up to the plate, and they said, "Well, we have funds for your island. We'll donate those funds to you, and we can do that. We can do that and support your project." My project really was to bring awareness about what's going on in my community, and how we have these two homesteads, Hawaiian homesteads, that have been greatly affected by fires constantly over several years. So if you're looking at those maps and the hottest spots areas, those areas that Clay talks about surround the Hawaiian homesteads, and this is common in all the islands. And as strapped as DHHL is for funds and funding to try to manage those lands, there are people out in those communities doing the same work that I'm doing, like the Aina Alliance on Kauai and other landowners who are trying to create these fire breaks. And a lot of us are using our own money. I mean, whatever funds that Hawaii Wildfire had given me, I try to stretch those funds as far as I can. My project will go on to two other phases, I'm hoping, and that might require funds later on. But my main focus was to create this fire break and use it as a teaching tool, or show the politicians and the people who can bring these funds in what we're really trying to do. One of my first funders told me that a lot of people aren't going to understand what you're trying to do. You basically have to build it and then show them. So in this process, if you bring up a picture of the fire break, I mean,
Okay.
you can basically see that when you remove the fuel in a certain area, you can stop the fire. I mean, I'm using that as an example, but what I really would like to see is that this FireWise program and all of what Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization does is implemented into all the Hawaiian homesteads and all of the islands, because we're the most affected. All of the Hawaiians, we're in these grasslands, we're around these areas, and the two or three hottest spots in all of these islands are right in my community, and that's why I'm working so diligently to try to get this point across. You know, I spent a career fighting these fires, and towards the end of it, it sort of became redundant that you keep on doing these same things over and over again. Why don't we just start removing the fuels from these areas where these homes are always threatened? And you know, when you try to bring it up to the people who say they care, or the politicians, sometimes they just don't see what you're trying to do. And so that was my main focus, try to create an example for them. And then right now, with what happened in Lahaina, I kind of pictured that in 2018 when I saw my farm and several other of my friends around where I live, their farms were destroyed. So I know what those people in Lahaina are going through. I don't like watching photos of Lahaina and what's going on. Like Clay said, all of these things are preventable. If we start managing these places in the proper sites, then maybe we can get a better handle on what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Paula. Really appreciate it. I'm wondering, you know, something you mentioned, Clay, earlier is that, you know, this requires a programmatic, systematic approach to dealing with. One thing that I've discovered, and well, I guess in some of my work, and obviously I haven't been doing it for years like yourself, but fire is a system. It has so many influencing factors. I'm just wondering, you know, what kind of approach do you see as being perhaps the most effective? Are there any lessons we can learn from other states, other countries, other areas of the world that might have a similar problem to Hawaii's, not necessarily here in the States, because I understand it's also unique within the United States because we're dealing with grasses rather than dealing with trees. So yeah, are there any places that you can recommend that people look for some solutions?
Yeah, I mean, the best example that comes to my mind is what Oregon State did, and where they passed a bill and they said, all right, we're going to establish this fund for mitigation. We're going to establish like conservation corps for like to actually create jobs to get people to do this work. It set up the state set up an extension program through the university to actually have agents in each county that would help people who want to come to the table and do this kind of work. As Elizabeth said earlier, it ends up falling kind of on Hawaii Wildfire. You know, I try to not promise people that I can like organize these large scale projects myself, but there's not a lot of people that are like, we don't have people that are willing to step up just because those positions don't exist. That capacity doesn't exist. And, you know, thinking about where we turn, that's kind of on the fuels management side, but there also needs to be similar investments on the community side, as Elizabeth was mentioning. So codes, right? Like what are the rules with respect to managing fuels and sort of these unmanaged lands out there? Like what are you know, landowners required to do, and then what is the capacity, which tends out to be very limited for the sort of to enforce those codes, right? So there's kind of like legal frameworks for it, and there's funding frameworks for it, and then obviously like the coordination. And I mean, we are coming at this, I think it's really important to just emphasize that we've got so much of like the building blocks for this. Like Elizabeth was saying, like we know the science, we have methods that work, demonstrations, like we can go out now to Bula's farm and other spots in Waianae and see like, oh, look, there's a green break, here's a grazing strip, this is like a regular old fuels break. And, you know, and we've seen them withstand fires, right? So this is not like, oh, we're waiting to see if this works. And that like the relationships are all there, right? This is what kind of puts Hawaii, I think, ahead of the curve and is reflected in, for example, the response that we're seeing to Lahaina devastation, right? Where like that connection, the ties, the relationships are really what's kind of driving response. And I think we'll have to drive response, preemptively, right? Proactively.
Yeah, if I could build on that, we clearly have a lot of gaps, but there has been a lot of really good work that has been done. We have programs that people can plug into. We've learned our way through this over the last 23 years. We have developed a lot of infrastructure that can be built upon. And the one thing I want to, I guess there's two things I want to point out, which is that prior to this new explosion of so many people scared, interested, affected, et cetera, it plugs into what Bula was saying, that a lot of times Hawaii hasn't been competitive in these national grant opportunities. And so Hawaii Wildfire has reached out and courted and nurtured and nourished relationships with our mainland partners. And now we are connected with all the leading edge folks across the country who are doing wildfire related work. And they know Hawaii. We had 40 people from the Wildland Fire Leadership Council here. In December, we showed them our landscapes. We brought them our partners. They heard from community fire departments and land managers. So we have been building those ties over time. And when they see what we have going on, they are marveling over our connectedness and our level of very integrated projects and partnerships and collaboration. And so that's something that I feel like all of us can make sure that we heard. And as we move forward, we need to acknowledge that coordinating and staying cohesive as we move forward with this broadened level of interest, broadened level of sort of stakeholders and people that are scared and motivated. We do still want to have that high level of coordination, because in other states, it is kind of chaos and there's a lot of competition and duplication. And if we don't have that many resources, we're an island state. We know how to work together. We just need to make sure that we are doing that as we move forward. So plug in, learn what you can, find out what's happened before. If you happen to be a decision maker and you're on the call, please know that a lot of good work has already happened, and we have co-developed priorities with lots of stakeholders, workshopped all over the state, community wildfire protection plans where everyone comes together, looks at the risk and identifies next steps. So there's a lot already been done. And then just a quick plug that coming up shortly, those community wildfire protection plans that bring everyone together to identify our priorities together. Hawaii County and Kauai were both funded to go through a whole new process and update all those plans. And we're proposing this year to do the same for Honolulu City and County, all of Oahu, and also Maui County. So pretty soon here, you'll have an opportunity to join. And now when you see the workshop flyers and you hear Community Wildfire Protection Plan, please come and learn with us. We'll learn together, we'll look at the risks together, and we'll figure out where we want to go next together. And so that's an opportunity to do that. And then I just wanted to leave one more thing, which is like, we've talked a lot about the gaps, and I just was saying, but so much has been done. So please build on that. But the other thing is right now, today, if you go home, there's so much you can already do, because even though we've talked a lot about wildland fuels exist around your home and yard. And there's a ton of stuff that you can do to take care of that and already reduce your risk. And that's like sweep, sweep, sweep. Get rid of any dead and dying vegetation, clean out your leaf piles. We don't like trees touching your roofs. And, basically we say lean, clean, and green. You want short grass. You want your trees limbed up tall. You want them away from your house. You want combustible free zone 0 to 5 feet from your home. These things make a huge difference when embers are flying. You don't want them to be able to land and just smolder and ignite. So all those little things you do can already make a difference. So while we're all collectively working on these big picture things, you have a lot of agency in the ignition resistance of your home and yard. And so I just wanted to make sure I get that in there so people don't feel helpless and like it's such a big problem. It's so multifaceted. In each area, it's really clear where we need to go next. A lot of homework has been done. And also there's so much you can do yourself. And we have workshops and materials available for you to use to guide your way on that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think you actually answered a few of our readers' questions in terms of what they can do on the individual level. But perhaps we only have a couple of minutes left, but I was wondering, what beyond people's homes and creating defensible spaces, which they can find a lot more information about by contacting you, and your organization, but beyond one's property, how can a member of the public really kind of best address or prevent fires, and what can they do? Like, what kind of stuff can people do beyond their homes to make a more defensible Hawaii?
Well, there's the neighborhood level program. So Firewise is a program that Division of Forestry and Wildlife and Hawaii Wildfire support and help you go through the process to rally neighbors and take action at the neighborhood and community level. And then also, advocating for land uses, for resilient landscapes that feed people and support, water availability and quality, and have farming, and all the active uses of our lands need capacity. And conservation and restoration is kind of a big piece of things too. So we have these vibrant landscapes. So supporting initiatives in that direction. And then advocating for the budgets that we talked about, and maybe even some new bills like what Clay proposed. There's a lot of advocacy that could happen here. There's a lot of communication and education about what the issues really are, what we can do as solutions. And I think people are getting up to speed. And then once that's there, I think we need to work on this system. I saw there was a comment that said, we are government, we elect people, we advocate, all of that. So I think what we haven't had yet is a critical mass to support those initiatives and those funding needs. And maybe we can move in that direction now. Do you have anything to add, Clay or Bula?
No, not really. I mean, just keep your eyes peeled. There's going to be things are going to be happening in terms of funding proposals, I think, and out of these reviews. So just and the water issue, I would just remind people to kind of keep that at the top of your sites like that. This is all related to what we're doing with water and where it's happening, and so these solutions are all going to require water as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. And Bula, sorry, I think he might have disappeared. I'm not sure. But I think we're running out of time, but maybe a little bit of time for one more question. And I think that this might be an interesting one for you guys, is the use of goats to graze fire breaks. I think I'll build upon this reader's question, asking whether that's appropriate, but I'm just wondering if you could kind of answer one last question about how this might really affect some conversations about invasive species and what we should be doing with them, because invasive grasses, from my reporting, I'm understanding more and more they're here to stay, and it's going to be pretty impossible to get rid of them. And invasive species, as much as we might not like having them around because of their detrimental effects, getting rid of them entirely actually fuels invasive grasses. So it's kind of like this interesting one where perhaps people are against ranching, but if you get rid of ranching, then it fuels the problem further. I'm just wondering if you could give anyone any advice as to how to deal with these issues and all of these kind of yes ands kind of as part of this whole conversation about wildfire.
I don't mind answering quickly and then passing it off to you, Clay. I think we have to remember that there's a lot of different kinds of animals and different kinds of grazing, et cetera. And so when we talk about grazing for fire fuels management, it's really about strategically managing fire fuels with domesticated animals that are well herded and are managing fuels in strategic key areas. So that's the first part of it. And it's not always goats, it can be sheep, it can be cows. And also some of these grasses were brought in for forage. And so they, if they're nutritious and palatable, that's a food production system and a fire risk reduction opportunity in areas that would be grazed anyway or would be managed as grazing lands, because desired land use and of the property owner matters in this equation too. So I think some of these grasses are responsible for our third highest production of food in the state, which is grazing and ranching. So it's not like it's all bad. It's just, and grazing is a very important tool. So when we're talking about these invasive species, we're talking about whether they're being managed or not, if the lands are being managed or not. And so it's a little less about if there's grass, but more like, is it being managed or used? And if not, what are the other options?
Yeah, I would just add, it's easy to confound like all grazing, which is sort of including wild ungulates and then managed ungulates. So yeah, totally. To do fire risk, you have to target your grazing. So it has to be managed. And I think that we need to keep in mind, and I kept bringing this back, 1 million acres, well, about 750,000 of those or so are under active grazing, active ranching. And the community of ranchers out there, there's many, many, many knowledgeable people. And that knowledge is so important because what they're dealing with is thousands and thousands of acres. And so we can't be naive about this problem, and we can't say to ourselves, oh, we're just going to reforest it all tomorrow. Like when we talk about reforestation projects and restoration projects, that's like an acre at a time, right? And so whether or not you sort of support grazing or you're against it or whatever, it's true that these wild ungulates, they hammer our native ecosystems. Hawaiian ecosystems do not mix well with these ungulates. And that's why we do fencing and all these other conservation projects we could talk ages about that are happening up Malka. But if you want to manage lands at the scale of the problem, ranchers are going to have to be at the table. They have amazing knowledge, amazing experience. They care for these places. And they're one of the few allies in this sort of struggle that can do so at huge, huge land areas. And then as far as what animal you use, you know, that's your preference. But I think we need to shift the gears and be thinking about, grazing contracts for fuels reduction, 100%. We need to
with longer term lease and adequate water infrastructure. And when there's adequate water infrastructure, then we have firefighting resources as well. We have nursery and planting operations that can happen. So water rights, I saw in the comments, someone brought that up, Clay brought it up. Water rights, water availability, water infrastructure is also really a big deal for the betterment and use of lands and for safety and firefighting resources. And so that is a very important topic of discussion that needs to be on the table too, as we're talking about reducing our wildfire risk.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I just looking at the chat, I can see everyone's so grateful for your time. Elizabeth, Clay, Bula, thank you so much for attending, sharing your knowledge, your wealth of experience and advice. It's been super informative. I just want to let everyone know if you have any questions or queries about Firewise communities, about any of the community level stuff that you can do, about free home assessments that occur statewide. I hope this is okay. I'm sending them all to you, Elizabeth. Please visit hawaiiwildfire.org. And for everyone who is attending, we will also be sending a recording if you would like to get a refresher, or there are any pieces of this conversation that you'd like to have a look at again, and that will be sent out by email later on. Also, just a quick reminder to our readers that we will be having a pop-up library event in Makawao on the 26th at the public library from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So please do come along and visit a few of us at the library there. And lastly, just a shout out to the environmental funders group of the Hawaii Community Foundation Marisla Fund of Hawaii for covering, for helping us cover climate change, and of course the Frost Family Foundation for that too. And Civil Beat's coverage of Maui County is supported in part by a grant from the Nuestro Futuro Foundation. And lastly, and certainly not least, just want to extend all of Civil Beat's aloha to everyone on Maui and express our deepest condolences for anyone who's lost a loved one, for those that we've lost on Maui on August 8 and in the following days. It's a terrible time, terribly tragic events, and yes, thanks again. Not much more can be said about that, but thank you again for attending, and I hope that you all took a lot out of this. I know I did.
Yeah, thanks for having us and everybody else.
Yeah, thank you for hosting this. It's an important conversation.